Continuing our series of psychoanalysis and mythology, today we shall discuss Greek and Indian myths. We have selected today three comparable myths, each from Greek and the Indian tradition for our discussion. And we have with us today our subject expert, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, can we start with the similarity between Greek and Indian myths?
Greek civilization and Hindu civilization both are very ancient civilizations. Both civilizations have a very rich inventory of myths, and the myths that populate the continent of mythology of both these civilizations come in a variety of color, flavor, uh, topics, themes, and so on. It's a very rich mythology both in the Hindu civilization and the Greek civilization. Why it is so important for us is this, that when we look at the myths of these two ancient civilizations, we find that the same concepts, the same desires, the same fears are articulated in the myths of both these civilizations. Myth is like a dream of the community. It is like a dream which is released in the waking state, just as a dream is released in the sleep state. Both are communications from the unconscious, but a dream is released in the sleep state and the myth is released in the waking state. So a myth tells us what is in the unconscious mind of the people, their deepest desires, their deepest fears, their aspirations, their creative way of handling these generic factors. And this gives us an idea, sort of a historical evidence, that what psychoanalysis talks about, the concepts of psychoanalysis are not uh, limited to the industrial revolution and the civilization thereafter. They are not just contemporary, they are eternal. Because this mythology tells us that the deepest of the fears and desires, the deepest of anxieties at various stages of development for a human being have been the same over the history of the human race. So the Oedipus that we find today also used to be there in the Greek civilization or the Hindu civilization. It is not that in the last 250 years Oedipus complex has come to exist. So the mythology from Greece and India gives us a constancy and perpetuity to the concepts of psychoanalysis, that they are eternally true human concepts. They are not the products of a contemporary historical age. The myths from Greece and India also tell us about the differences, that at one level there are psychobiological commonalities at the foundation, because human beings are the same everywhere. However, after you get over the psychobiological foundations, then the cultural differences come in. That different groups of people, they almost act as a cultural subspecies. And just as there is similarity between human beings, there is also differences between human groups. And the Greek civilization represents the Western man, and the Hindu civilization in a way represents the Eastern man, and there are radical differences in the way the minds operate in the East and in the West. And therefore we see the same Oedipal anxiety comes up in the form of a Oedipal myth, but the Oedipal myth in Greece and Oedipal myth in India are very different. So while in a generic sense both of them are dealing with Oedipal anxieties and Oedipal desires, but many other factors have come in and therefore the socio-cultural influence on the way the generic psychobiological entities are handled in the mind, even at the level of unconscious. It tells us that there is a strong socio-cultural component, a strong component of the flavor of civilization, a strong component of what is passed down the ages through genes in the people that belong to that race. And therefore, the socio-cultural component of the myth, because what happens here is the generic psychobiological entities are worked upon by a variety of other factors in the mind. And these other factors have a strong socio-cultural component. And this is where uh, a study of the Greek and Hindu myths is so enriching, because it gives us one, insight into the unconscious of people of ancient times. Two, it provides us with evidence of constancy, perpetuity, and truthfulness of psychoanalytic concepts. Three, it tells us how, even in dealing with the most basic of biopsycho fundamental concepts, even at the unconscious level, strong elements of racial characteristics, cultural characteristics, the geosocial characteristics, they play a strong part. They also, fourth, it also tells us how the Western mind, which comes from Greece, essentially is binary and Abrahamical in its character, while that which comes from the East essentially is synthetic, integrative, and tolerant of ambivalence in its basic nature. Essentially, it's a pluralistic mind. So the singularism of the West and the pluralism of the East comes out in this discussion that we have of trying to psychoanalytically understand the Greek myths and the Hindu myths. And lastly, the myths provide us with raw material, because there would be many myths corresponding to which we don't actually have a psychoanalytic concept, which means psychoanalysis has missed something. So it is also a data awaiting conclusion, which would be a psychoanalytic concept.
So what makes this two category of myths so important to psychoanalysis then?
One, the Greek myths represents in a way the mythological world of the West, while the Hindu myths represent in a way the mythological world of the East, and the two put together gives us almost a global picture of the myth of the world. One. Two, it is very necessary to see how we can classify all the myths. And one way to do it is to use Joseph Campbell's model. Joseph Campbell says that all myths can be essentially classified into three parts. Myths of people who are living in forests. And these myths essentially are animistic in nature. And they talk about there being spirits in trees and plants and rivers and so on. So we have the myth of Seshnag, the myth of Ganga Mata, the myth of Prithvi Mata. In the West, we have the myth of Gaia, the conscious earth. So these are the myths of level 1, when people are still in the forest habitat. So when human beings are living in the forest, the mythology essentially is animistic in its flavor. That's what Campbell says. Then he says people go into an agricultural existence. And when from the forest, people come into agricultural existence, the myths change. And the myths become the myths of rain god, wind god, fire god, earth god, and so on. The factors of production which are so essential to agriculture, each of that factors is given a god. So there is a rain god, a sun god, a earth god, a wind god, and so on. And in India we have the Varun Devta, Surya Devta, Megh Devta, Prithvi Mata. These are this is the second stage of myth development according to Campbell. And the third stage is what he says are metaphorical myths. Myths which are more sophisticated, myths which actually talk about the deeper unconscious desires, fears, and aspirations. And these are metaphorical myths. The myth of Ganesha, the myth of Sisyphus, the myth of Aswasthama, the myth of Narcissus, all these myths are very, very metaphorical myths which deal with deepest of existential and psychoanalytic issues. So when we look at the two categories of myth, the Hindu and the Greek, all these factors, they come out very well when we discuss these two myths from a psychoanalytic standpoint. Just one more
So
point.
which,
Just one more
yeah,
point. I forgot
yeah,
one more
yes.
point. Uh, in the last question, I had remarked that when we discuss the Greek and the Hindu myths, one element comes out: the binary, a Brahmanical, and a singular nature of the mind of Greece and thereby of the Western civilization, and the pluralistic, integrative, and ambivalence tolerating mind of the East, which comes out in the Hindu civilization. Of course, these are not watertight compartments. You will today have many people in the West who are more plural than those in the East. But as a general historical argument, it is true that the Western mind historically, in general, has been has been on the path of singularism, and the East, particularly Hindu civilization, has been on the path of pluralism. And this reflects in the mythology also. Now, when we look at Joseph Campbell's classification, again we notice a difference between Hindu myths and the Greek myths. And that is, you see a strong utilitarian flavor in the Greek myths. In the Greek mythology as a whole, if you look, of the agro stage, the forest stage, the agro stage, and the metaphorical stage, you will find it is very heavy in the agro stage and in the forest stage, relatively speaking. Whereas if you look at the Hindu mythology, the relative weight of the metaphorical myths is much higher compared to the forest myths, the animistic myths, and the agro myths. Now, there is an element also of utilitarianism and reverence to existence. When we look at the Greek myths, we find a very utilitarian approach to environment. And this is true even today in the environmental movements of the West. That the approach essentially is utilitarian. That we should save trees because we cannot exist without trees. If tomorrow somebody invents a machine which can take in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, we no longer have to save trees. It's a very utilitarian movement, very transactional. Whereas in the East, we save trees because we worship them out of reverence, believing everything is sacred and God is present in everything. Even those who don't believe in God, they do believe that everything is sacred. So all the spiritual schools of the East, particularly of the Hindu civilization, the reverence for nature is out of pure sacred reverence. It is not utilitarian. And this dichotomy of utilitarian approach versus the reverential approach is present in the Greek mythology and Hindu mythology also. The Greek mythology, you will see a lot of utilitarianism, whereas in the Hindu mythology, you will essentially see an unconditional reverence.
So, sir, which is the Greek and Indian myths that you would like to discuss today, and why?
I would like to take up three Greek myths which are very popular, and corresponding to that, as near we can get to them as possible, the Hindu myths. Of course, there are no exact equivalents because of the civilizational differences. And that is where the socio-cultural differences come in. That even though essentially the Greeks and the Hindus both are human beings, at the most foundational psychobiological level both have the same concerns, yet the way they deal with these concerns is very different. So there is similarity and there is a difference. So I have chosen three myths from the Greek mythology, very popular myths. The myth of Narcissus, the myth of Oedipus, and the myth of Sisyphus. These three are very popular Greek myths, and corresponding to each we have the Hindu myths. For the myth of Narcissus, the nearest that we have is the myth of Kuber, the myth of Draupadi, the myth of Chandra. Nearest to the myth of Oedipus, we have the myth of Ganesha. And nearest to the myth of Sisyphus, we have the myth of Ashwasthama. Now, the second part of the question you asked, why I chose these three myths. Two reasons. One, these three myths are very popular, people know them, so it's easy to discuss them in the context of in the context of psychoanalysis and in the context of the Greek and the Hindu background. Two, if we look at man, we psychoanalytically see man in 3 or 4 different contexts. So we see man all alone, we see man in a dyad, we see man in a triad, and we see man in society. So Freud says when we are born, initially there is no concept of I and not I. There is only one thing that is existing. There is an oceanic state. There is no the other. There is only I, and the not I is still not recognized. There is only I. There is an oceanic feeling. It is one without the other. And this is what he calls the state of primary narcissism. And then we come to the state of secondary narcissism, where there is the other, the mother. And the child is frustrated from the other and gets into secondary narcissism. But that is still a two-person event. So primary narcissism is a one-person event, secondary narcissism is a two-person event, and both of them are addressed in some way by the myth of Narcissus. Then we come to the three-person event, the child, the mother, and the father. So initially we had only child, then we had child and the mother. Both of them were addressed by the myth of Narcissus. Then we have a three-person situation, the child, the mother, and the father, where between the mother and the father, there is a relationship on which the child has no control, and this creates anxiety and this creates a lot of emotions. And this is a very simple situation of many things that we face in life. Very few people are comfortable with triangles, because every triangle creates anxiety and lot of emotions like envy, possessiveness, anger, hatred, destruction, and whatnot. Okay. So the three-person situation is represented by the myth of Oedipus. And then man goes out in the society and he is in the social process of many. And in that social process, things happen. And the bravest of people would try to change the society as they want them to be, for good or for worse. And in middle of this social process, we have many people, man in the middle of many people, and very complicated relationships. It is not one triangle, but 3 triangles and 4 squares and 5 pentagons all together working. And this is the representative situation of man in society, man in organization. man in his neighborhood, man in the web of his relationships. And this is represented by Sisyphus. So, man alone, man with another person, man in a triangle, and man in society. All the four essential situations are represented by these three myths, and they cover a very large area of human experience and human challenges. So these are the three myths with their corresponding Hindu counterparts, nearest that one can find to them, is what I have selected for psychoanalytic discussion. So we can compare and contrast the myths from Hindu civilization and Greek civilization, covering these four essential conditions of human existence.
Sir, so what difference do we see in Narcissus and his Indian counterpart?
Very interesting differences we see. The myth of Narcissus tells us that Narcissus was uh, punished by gods, that he would come down on earth and he would die out of unreciprocated love. And he sees himself in a lake, falls in love with his own image, does not hear what Echo says, the angel who is in love with him and is following him. So Echo keeps calling him, but he cannot hear Echo. And the names are also very important. Echo means the echo of the sound, but he cannot hear the echo. Right? And whenever he tries to touch and grab into reality, that mythical surreal self-image, it disintegrates. So he cannot have a non-disintegrated self. And he dies out of unreciprocated love. The myth of sorry, I by mistake said Ganesha. The nearest myth to Narcissus is the myth of Kuber, Chandra, and Draupadi. So the eastern nearest myths are the myth of Kuber, where uh, Kuber feels that he is very rich and invites everyone for dinner. And he invites Lord Ganesha also. And the myth is that he acts very pompous out of his narcissism. So Ganesha decides to teach him a lesson. So Ganesha goes there, eats up everything, then nothing is left. And he tells Kuber that I am hungry, so you have to provide me food since you have asked me to come. So then nothing is left, so he eats away all the utensils. Still he is hungry. So then he goes and tells Kuber that now I am going to eat you. So he runs after Kuber and Kuber runs for his life. He goes to Ganesha's mother who gives him a modak, a sweet, and then Ganesha's hunger is satisfied. So this is the myth of narcissism of Kuber. Similarly, the narcissism of Draupadi, who believes she deserves the best of everything in this world and wants the 5 best people all in one, which cannot happen, and therefore she gets 5 different husbands. And then we have the myth of Chandra, who narcissistically falls in love with his own beauty and starts bragging about it and angering Ganesha, who then runs after him and eats him up. And then the night and day cycle is disturbed, so gods come to him and ask Ganesha to release Chandra, who is humbled by that and then is released. And then we have the myth of Mahadev, Shiva, who is sitting all alone, completely absorbed in himself on the Himalayas, in very much a state of primary narcissism. So if we look at Chandra, Draupadi, and Kuber, they seem more like secondary narcissism cases or secondary narcissism manifestations, not cases. Whereas in Shiva, it looks more like a manifestation of primary narcissism. Right? Now, the differences are very important. If we look at the Greek treatment of the myth of Narcissus, narcissism is not uh, criticized so severely in an individualistic Greek culture. Whereas, if we look in the East, narcissism generally comes down with a punishment. So, Kuber is punished, Draupadi is punished, and Chandra is punished. So, in collectivistic societies which value collectivism more than individualism, authority of elders more than the freedom of the young population, continuity more than revolutionary innovation, stability more than creativity. These societies, they treat the generic problem of narcissism in a very different way. So in the Greek treatment of narcissism, uh, we don't find a condemnation of narcissism. In fact, from an artistic standpoint, it is almost seen as a dramatic tragedy. It's seen as a surreal tragedy. It's not seen as a social mistake. It is seen as a surreal tragedy, something to be dramatized, something to be lived out, almost like a tragic drama. It's almost like a platonic tragic drama for catharsis. So people look at it from a standpoint of a romantic tragedy, a surreal drama, but they don't look at it as a social mistake up for condemnation. Whereas in the East, the narcissism is looked upon as something that is not welcome and is socially condemnable. And generally, it is spoken of in a myth along with criticism, condemnation, and often punishment. And this also gives us an idea into the way the Eastern and the Western mind works. The Eastern mind is very uh, dominating, confirming, making people bow down before collectivity and conform to things, valuing continuity, stability, and conformity more than individual freedom and creativity. Whereas in the West, the it's my life phenomena, the individualism, the innovation precedes over continuity, stability, and conformity. And this essential character of the West, which it derives from Greece, comes out even in the culture that we see today. We have far more Silicon Valleys in the West than we have in the East, although you have huge population in the East compared to the West.
And maybe this is why the in our culture there are a lot of people who feel guilty about what they have done.
Yes,
The collective conscious rise gives rise to the guilt
true.
feeling. Yeah. So, sir, then how is Greek Oedipus different and comparable to the Indian myth?
Greek Oedipus kills the father and gets the Oedipal object. So the young man is victorious. Although he atones for it later, but essentially he is victorious. The young, the rebel, the innovator, the one who breaks from the continuity of the past, who crosses the line of taboo, who crosses the line of continuity and convention, wins, although to atone for it later. However, in the Eastern comparable myth, the Oedipal child is actually beheaded instead of the the son killing the father, it is the father killing the son. And that tells us that actually the father castrates the son and thereafter bestows masculinity as a blessing out of his magnanimity. So the masculinity and the power of the child, of the son, has to be given by the father to the son. The son does not earn it by his bravery or adventure. The omnipotence of the father figure is reinforced by the castration of the son, and the son then has to conform to the father in order to get the power and the masculinity. So this is very different
Else,
in East and West.
huh,
Yeah.
okay. Else they are penalized.
Yes. Yeah. And the father wins in the
The
Oedipal
father
era.
wins.
And the castration actually happens in the East, whereas in the West, the castration actually does not happen. There is a fear of it.
Hmm.
And therefore, the victorious Oedipus comes out as an innovator, as a rebel, as a free man. Whereas in the East, the castrated individual comes out as conforming to tradition, internalizing the father, identifying with the conventions, and he becomes then the next father. Another important element is the
Hmm.
erotic nature or the non-erotic emotional nature of the Oedipal triangle.
Hmm.
In
Okay.
the Greek myth, it is a highly erotic myth, whereas in the Hindu myth, it is not really a erotic myth in the Greek sense of the term. In the
Hmm.
Apollonian sense of the term, it is more of
Hmm.
an emotional myth.
Hmm.
Oedipus is
Right.
more of an emotional triangle rather than an erotic triangle.
Correct.
And uh, the Greek myth is very earthly myth. It does not have a surreal component into it beyond the irony of the coincidence that the oracle comes true. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, in the Eastern myth, we have uh, the head of the elephant transplanted onto a human being. The salvation is very surreal. There is mysticism, there is supernatural. There is also this another surreal element of the father not knowing the son. And that I think is common to both myths, that the son does not know the father and the father does not know the son. And therefore, the, the Oedipal process happens almost in absentia of recognition of the father.
Okay.
Because if the father was recognized, the Oedipal process would find itself very difficult to proceed.
Right.
The paternal, the moral would impede the process itself. So the process proceeds in absentia of the psychological father, of the paternal, in both cases.
And sir, how about Sisyphus and Ashwatthama then?
The myth of Sisyphus is the myth of somebody. There are many myths of Sisyphus, and one myth that I have taken up for analysis is this: Sisyphus is about to die, and the messenger of death comes. The name of that messenger is Thanatos, and he puts chains on Sisyphus to take him to the world of the dead. And Sisyphus says, I feel curious how these chains would look on you. Let me put them on you and see how it happens. How do you look in them? And Thanatos agrees. So Sisyphus puts the chains of death on Thanatos itself, chains Thanatos. And because Thanatos is chained, uh, no other person dies on earth and everyone becomes old and sick. And a very difficult situation arises. So gods are furious. They want to know who has done it. And they condemn Sisyphus to a life worse than death. That because you wanted to cheat death, now you will have a life worse than death. And the life will be, you will push a big stone up the mountain from morning till evening, and when the evening comes you will have to let go, so the stone comes back again, and next morning again you will start, and this will go on for eternity. Your life will be so difficult that you will uh, curse yourself that why you did not choose death, and you will ask for death but we will not give you death. It will be a life 10 times worse than death. So this was the myth of Sisyphus, and Albert Camus used this myth to designate the human condition of large number of human beings on this planet, that most of us are living the life of Sisyphus, doing the same drudgery over and over again every day. To return again to the same thing at night and again start in the morning with the same monotonous routine. And one day, after thousands of years, it occurs to Sisyphus, what if he defies the gods and refuses to put the stone up and do these things? What worse can the gods do? So the thought of rebellion against the gods and against destiny, against circumstances, comes up in Sisyphus, and he decides to be the revolutionary for one last time. So this is the extension of the myth of Sisyphus on one side. There are many myths, I have chosen one of them. With Ashwatthama, the myth is this, that towards the end of Mahabharata, he goes and kills everyone who is asleep on the other side, because he believes that Pandavas had used deceit to kill most of the Kaurav leaders. And therefore, there was nothing wrong if he also practiced cunning and deceit and killed them while they were asleep. There was nothing immoral in that. So he goes there, and instead of the Pandavas, their children are sleeping, so he kills all the children. And then he realizes that there is one girl on the Pandava side who is pregnant. So he uses his Brahmastra, the lethal weapon, to kill the child who is in the womb, so that the racial link of the enemies is completely cut off, and they don't have any inheritor to carry on the family. And everyone asks him, including Lord Krishna, to take back the arrow. He refuses to do so. And for this act, and for the act of killing everyone asleep, he is cursed that he will always have unbearable fire in his head. And with that unbearable fire, it's almost like the fire of hell inside the head. He will live on for eternity. And when that becomes unbearable, he will have to ask people wherever he is to provide something cool to him to either drink or to apply to manage that fire. Now, the common point between Sisyphus and Ashwatthama is both of them are condemned to eternity. There is no salvation for them. Somehow, the sin that they committed in the eyes of God was so great that there was no salvation possible. There was no atonement possible. The guilt could not be atoned for. The pain could not be borne out. And the sin that they committed in both cases, in their own view, was not a sin at all. It was a just revenge. It was a just act. They did something and the opposite party did something. It was like a table tennis ping pong. You give a shot and I give a shot. But there was nothing like a sin in their own views.
No, but just that it was a mass destruction.
Of
It affected many lives, right?
yes, 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 yes. But in their own view, it
Yeah.
was not a sin. because they thought it was a natural part of the conflict which was going on. And the other side had done equally bad things to warrant this thing from their side. So there was a kind of a moral dichotomy that in an absolute frame of reference, what they did was terribly wrong. But in the relativistic frame of reference which they themselves were using, there was nothing wrong in what they did. And this brings us to something very interesting. In case of Sisyphus, Sisyphus never believes that he has done anything morally wrong, even after he is condemned. But in case of Ashwatthama, there is a dual struggle going on in his mind. One part of him says he has not done anything wrong, but one part of him accepts that there might be something wrong and he feels guilty about it. He is in ambivalence. And the ambivalence slowly shifts in the favor of guilt, in the favor of atonement. But still, it is not completely free from the anger which he feels was a just anger. Second, in case of Sisyphus, he never accepts gods as great or holy or right, neither before condemnation nor after condemnation. There is a continuous struggle and rejection of the parent figure. There is a continuous anger with the parent figure. There is no submission to the parent figure. But in case of Ashwatthama, he accepts in some way that Lord Krishna was not a normal human being. He was a representative of God, and what he said cannot be wrong in some way. So there is a submission to God, to the paternal figure, even though the paternal figure condemns him and punishes him. So the submission to the superego is there, regardless of how harsh the superego may be, how unrealistic the superego may be, but there is still a submission to the paternal. Lastly, the rebellion of Sisyphus is not seen in Ashwatthama. Ashwatthama accepts his sin, the defiance of the paternal, and the need to atone, and even if the punishment be disproportionate, he still accepts the punishment. There is no rebellion in Ashwatthama. Whereas in Sisyphus, we see the rebellion. Even though defeated, right, the suffering becomes unbearable, and the unbearable suffering again leads to a revolution. Whereas here, although the suffering is unbearable, the guilt is accepted, the paternal voice is accepted, even silencing the voice of the self which is not completely in agreement with the paternal voice. But there is no rebellion against the paternal, because at some level there is acceptance of the omnipotence of the paternal and the submission to the command of the paternal, and also the acceptance of one's own guilt, which is not there in Sisyphus. In Sisyphus, we see rebellion, but we don't see guilt and atonement. And therefore, the Hindu Sisyphus, so to say, is very different. The superego is quite strong. The acceptance of the paternal is quite strong. The spiritual element is quite strong. And there is the Hindu Sisyphus is a more in a depressive position versus the Greek Sisyphus, who is in a far more paranoid schizoid position. And this, I think, also talks about the way good and evil and the bipolarities are dealt with by both civilizations. We find ambivalence, the depressive position, far more in the myths of the Hindu civilization compared to those of the Greek civilization. And today between India and the West in a way. And this also refers to what Jung said once, that the the binary thinking, the Abrahamical thinking, the singularism of West does not allow for integration of the shadow, and therefore many of the cultural products remain neurotic because of the split being open underneath. The East, by contrast, allows the integration of the shadow, allows the depressive position, allows ambivalence, allows the shades of gray, and therefore the cultural products in that sense, in that Jungian sense, are less neurotic, and they are more integrative in their flavor. You can see even in the case of Ravana, although Ravan was supposed to be uh, almost a symbolization of evil, and Rama killed him. While Ravan is on the deathbed, he asks his brother Lakshmana to go and learn from Ravan the art of administration, because Ravan had created a city of gold. The Ram could never create a city of gold. If you look in GDP terms, GDP growth of Lanka was much higher than Ayodhya. And if both were finance ministers, Ravan was a much better finance minister than Ram was. So Ravan could create that high GDP growth, but it was growth at any cost, mostly at the cost of ethics. And the Hindu civilization chooses there to celebrate not the GDP growth of Lanka, but the ethical growth of Ayodhya. And that also talks about the uh, one, about the ethical preference of civilization, and two, about combining the good and the bad, that even in the all bad figure of Ravana there are good parts. It is not a split open with only bad. And that integrative element of the East and the binary element of the West, they come out very vividly when we look at the myth of Sisyphus and the comparable myth of Ashwatthama.
Okay. So now I know where do we all get our submissive nature, the guilt conscious from. Well, it was a wonderful discussion, sir, and I personally enjoyed it a lot. So we have been discussing such mythologies, and today was a classic uh, talk where we compared the Greek and the Indian myths. Hope you all liked it, and do write to us at hveindia@gmail.com. Thank you, sir. Namaste.
Namaste.